Hi everyone, tonight I'm going to be talking about how to deploy code to RoboRIO, how to get a RoboRIO set up so that it can receive code, and different methods to connect with it. So the first thing I'm going to be talking about is methods to connect to RoboRIO, and that's, let me go to my desktop for that. So here's the RoboRIO 2.0, which is most likely the computer that you're going to be using. And this houses all the code and everything like that and controls everything on the robot. And there are three main ways to connect to it. One of which is a wireless connection through a radio, and then there are two methods that are through a wire. So the first method is the wireless one, and that's through a radio. And radios it's a little like white box that you connect through using Wi-Fi. You've probably already done that once or twice before, or you've seen someone else do it. So that's the main way that you communicate with the robot on the field, and in practices it's just the most convenient because you don't need any pesky wires or anything. And then the two wired ways to connect are through either this USB-B here, and that would just be a USB bit that connects to your computer and then goes directly into the RoboRIO, or through Ethernet, which also just connects to your laptop or computer and then goes directly to the RoboRIO. And in actuality, the radio actually communicates through this Ethernet port. So if you want to have a wired Ethernet connection, you're most likely going to have to remove the radio in order to connect to it. But those are the methods. An important thing to remember is that these three different ways to connect to the robot all have different IP addresses that you have to enter. So let me show you where that is. So here in a robot project, whenever you're deploying, you're going to have to think about that. So the most likely way that you're going to connect to a robot is through the radio, and the IP for that, let me get a notepad so you can see this. So through radio, the way to do it is 10.26.14.2, and that's going to go into this IP address here, so 10.26.14.2, and so it'll connect. Now that that's set, it'll connect through radio. The next IP that you have to remember is through this USB-B cable, which is probably the second most common way to connect. So through USB is 172.22.11.2, and that's gonna be these are gonna be pretty ingrained in your mind. The third way is through Ethernet, and that is actually, it kind of varies sometimes. So the way that I normally find it, and this is a way that you can always find what IP you need, is by going in your driver station. If you go into here, this second the second thing here, if you have a connection, it'll show an IP address under this radio. Oh, my webcam's in the way. In this radio thing right here, it'll say what the USB is, and if you're connecting through Ethernet, it'll show the IP here, and that will vary. So that's why it's a little more annoying to use, but that's where you can find it, and that's where you can find all of these other USB too. So that varies. But yeah, so this IP address varies with the team number. Obviously it's 2614 if you're on Mars, and then this is always going to be the same. So whenever you're helping teams in the future, in Tucker teams or whatever, keep that in mind. So that's the different ways to connect to the RoboRIO. Now we're going to talk about the different ways that code kind of runs on the robot. There are two main types. There are two ways to put code on the robot. And this is the same in LabVIEW and Java, I'm pretty sure. There's one called deploying live, and or you might call it running live, deploying live. And the second way is by building, also called running a startup, if you're just building code on the robot. So the deploying live means that basically it's running locally on your computer and then transmitting that code to the robot. So what you're able to do, at least in LabVIEW, is you can probe values in the code because you're able to see the code running. And so you're able to see exactly what's happening in the code, and you can much more easily find any problems, any issues, and it's easier to modify code and then redeploy. It's much faster. Building code is a much more permanent thing, where if you know that your code works, you build and run a startup on the robot, and then what that does is that whenever the robot turns off and then turns back on, the code that you put as run a startup is going to run on startup. So it's going to be there whenever the robot turns on, and so you need that whenever you set your robot on the field at the start of the match, and then you turn your robot on. You want it to have code, all the code that you have written for it. So, and often at Mars, whenever we implement a major change and we've tested it, then we run a startup to have a version of the code on the robot that's always usable and also safe. So the way that you do that, in order to run live, you just need to make sure that you have the right code here, and then all you have to do is hit this run button. And obviously it's not going to work for me because I'm at home and I'm not connected to a robot, but it'll run through a deployment process. It'll take a little longer the first time that you deploy, but on sequential deploys it'll be a little more optimized. And whenever you deploy live, you're able to easily stop the code. Yeah, it's gonna give an error message. You're usually able to stop the code by hitting this abort execution button, or by hitting the finish button, and so that will stop the code from running, and then you're able to modify the code however you want, and then you can just hit the run button to deploy again. In order to run a startup, what you need to do is go into this project explorer, go to build specifications here, like expand this menu, right click on the FRC robot boot up deployment, and first you're going to hit build. And this is actually a local operation on your computer. It's kind of like compiling in other languages, where it combines all the code together into one package that can be sent to like a computer like the RoboRIO. So if you hit build, it's actually going to run through the build process on my computer. It might take a while depending on how big your project is. I think the Marvin 15 project took about a minute. But it really depends on how complex your code is, how many VIs you have, etc. But I'm going to pause until the build is complete. Alright, so our build is complete, and you can technically go to the file path if you want and see what that build looks like. It's just a bunch of VIs like together and like an exe. And then you have to do the second step, which is to actually put the code onto the robot. This is very similar to deploying live. So you right click here and hit run as startup. And you notice that there's also an option to deploy, which is actually running live in that same menu. So it's sort of like, it's almost the same thing. And obviously this isn't going to work again, but this process takes like 10 seconds. It's not that fast, or not that slow. But that is how you deploy code live or run code live, and also how you build and run a startup code. That's very important to be able to do, and sometimes can sometimes be a little bit annoying depending on how your code is structured, or like how like optimized your code is. Hello, welcome to me in the future. This is going to be part 2 of this video, which is going to be going over the RoboRIO imaging tool and the FRC radio configurator. And so the RoboRIO imaging tool is basically a way to prepare the RoboRIO for getting FRC code. It's a way to update the software that's on it, and sometimes recover it whenever it gets corrupted or something bad happens. So what you're going to do is, to work the RoboRIO imaging tool, you're just going to open it up, and you're going to connect to the RoboRIO through one of the 3 methods. Ideally, you want to connect through a wired connection, because if you start formatting a RoboRIO, if you start adding software to it, and then it gets disconnected, like sometimes happens through a radio, bad things can happen. It can get corrupted, and it can be really annoying to fix. So ideally you go through a wired connection or like USB or Ethernet so that doesn't happen. So whenever you open it, it'll show a RoboRIO target on the left, and I have a few pictures or screenshots from whenever I did this at Mars. So the normal window is going to look like this, where it has format target here. Your RoboRIO target's going to show up on the left here. And so this default tab, which is format target, is for re-imaging the RoboRIO. So there's kind of two different things they need to think about here. There's one tab that's update firmware. And this is something that you're going to do very rarely. You might do it when you first get a RoboRIO, or if you're just obtaining it and you need a full reset. This basically gets rid of everything on the RoboRIO, and it's like the very basic part of the OS of RoboRIO. So you're not going to be messing with this very often, maybe like once a year, if that. However, format target is something that you might be doing. It's something that you'll do if you need to like totally reset the code. So if you have something built on there that you want to completely remove, so if you're moving RoboRIOs from one robot to another, you would reformat it, which would completely get rid of any code that's built on there and give you a clean slate. And you would also re-image or reformat the RoboRIO if, say, the code corrupts or there's some sort of weird thing where you can't put code on the RoboRIO anymore. It's just something that sort of resets the code, brings you to a blank slate, something that you can easily put code on. The other tab in the software is Edit Startup Settings. This is something that you'll do pretty rarely as well. The only 2 settings here are Enable Console Out, which is, I'm pretty sure that's used for Java. I don't think we even use it in LabVIEW. I think it's for some sort of thing to do with the console and the driver station, but normally you don't even need to worry about it. I think normally you leave it checked, and disable RT startup app is actually kind of important. So the RT startup is something called real-time startup, and that's basically the function that allows built code to start whenever the RoboRIO gets power. So if you disable that, that means that built code will not start, and the only way that you can run code is running live. The only real scenario that you do use this is if there's something really wrong with the RoboRIO and you're trying to recover it. So normally you won't mess with any of these. And obviously the team number at the top, put in 2614. But that's really the only thing with the RoboRIO imaging tool. To re-image the target, just select the correct image, whether it's RoboRIO 1 or RoboRIO 2, and these images come with the game tools that you download with LabVIEW. But sometimes they release updates to these images throughout the season if there are issues, like there are sometimes a lot of LabVIEW issues at the start of the season, and sometimes they'll release new versions. So you see the most recent one is version 4.0, so they released 4 updates during the season, so keep track of that. And all you do is you just click the image and then you hit reformat, and it'll take a minute or two. Won't take too long. And it's the same with update firmware. You just select the firmware, click update, and same with starter settings. Just select what you want and hit apply. And so it's the RoboRIO imaging tool. It's something you need to know. And the other thing is something called the the FRC radio configurator, or a configuration utility. That's what it's actually called. And I have a video from Mars on how to operate this. Alright, so for the radio configurator, or configuration utility, there are 2 scenarios where you're going to be using this utility. One is whenever you're renaming the name of a radio. So whenever you connect to a radio, it'll have the team number, so for us 2614, an underscore, and then some sort of name. So for instance, for Marvin 15, we had Marvin 15 Alpha. For Beta, we had Marvin 15 Beta. For test benches, you'll have some sort of test bench name or some sort of different name. And that's important so that since the names are different, you're able to know which radio you're connected to just based on the name. And so you won't have any dangerous scenarios where you're enabling a robot that you can't see or something like that. So it's very important to have the radio names easy to identify and easy to recognize. And the second scenario that you'll use the radio configurator is actually after an FRC event, because whenever you go to an event, you'll have to take the radio off the robot and give it to them, and they will encrypt the radio so that the radio connects to the FMS, the field management system, instead of to any computers, so that 6 robots can connect to one field. And also so that there isn't any cross interference with different teams and whatever. So after you go to an event, the radio is still going to be encrypted, so you have to decrypt it, basically just reconfigure it, and that's when you'll use this utility. So this first one will show up. Normally you'll just go through Ethernet, so just go Ethernet and hit OK. An important thing to know whenever you're configuring a radio is it has to be in this this configuration. So you're going to need this black power wire to connect to this small hole here, and that's the power. And then the Ethernet has to go in this first slot, and it shows that in the configuration, has to go into this first slot. And that way it'll have power and you're able to configure it. Normally we don't actually use this black wire on the robot because of something called power over Ethernet, but you're not able to do that just using a computer. So you'll have to get this power wire, ask Electrical, ask Program Mentor to set that up for you whenever you get a radio. And essentially what you're going to do is you'll just connect through Ethernet, and I'll just play the video.
I'm just going to commentate over it later.
Let me see if this works. Because
so these flashing lights will be on, and then you'll just be connected through Ethernet.
Oh, no, it has the edge.
One thing about the name here is that you just want to put in 2614 here, and then it'll have an underscore, and then the robot name will show up. So you don't need to put in 2614 underscore or anything like that. So for instance, that's how I put in the name for Marvin 15 Alpha, is just you put in 2614, it'll have an underscore, and then you put in the robot name. A lot of these things you don't need to worry about. A WPA key is a way to put a password on the radio, but more often than not, you don't really need to do that. So normally we just leave it blank. We do use open mesh radios. Normally we just go 2.4 gigahertz. Doesn't really matter what mode it's in. And I mean, obviously it does matter, but normally we just use 2.4 gigahertz. This firewall is actually what the that people who are at the events use to encrypt the radios. So that's something that you'll never really use. And the BW limit is actually, it's bandwidth limiting. So on an actual field, there is a bandwidth limit to how much information can go through the radio. Normally you want to keep this on because it's good to emulate how the field is going to work with your robot. Normally you don't even get close to how much bandwidth, normally you don't even get close to the limit, but sometimes you'll want to check that if you really want to have like a super complex, like off-field robot, but it's like never going to happen. So normally you'll just leave this checked, leave all this default, and just change the robot name. If you just got a new radio, you have to load the firmware, but otherwise you'll just hit this configure button, and I don't think it's in this video. So sometimes what you have to do is sometimes it doesn't work, like this video that Sean made, there's an error. So a solution that he came up with, I have never had to do this.
It would be cool, but also extremely stressful.
What you do is you go into your network settings, go to change adapter, and you just disable every network adapter other than Ethernet. Sometimes it's a little bit weird like that, and just restart the radio configurator. And then eventually he gets it successful.
I never actually watched
and
it.
the bar just goes over,
That sounds
and
funny.
then there you go.
Okay,
There's a
there we
success.
go. I kind of want to watch that.
Yeah.
And so that was us configuring a radio 1 or 2 Wednesdays ago. But yeah, that's how you configure a radio. It's an important thing to be able to do. And yeah, I think that's going to be it for this video. That was kind of a bunch of utility things, a bunch of technical information. So if you have any questions at all, be sure to let me or any other programmer or mentor know. And yeah, have a good day.